All right, bundle up, everyone, because today we're going deep into the science of cold exposure.
Yeah, and it's more than just taking a quick ice bath.
Right, with cold plunging and ice baths becoming so popular, we figured it's the perfect time to look at what the science actually says
Yeah.
about the benefits, and you know how to explore this safely yourself.
So let's imagine just jumping into icy water.
Oh, okay.
You get that immediate cold shock response, right? Your
Yeah.
heart rate jumps, your breath catches, your
Yeah.
body's basically screaming, "Get me out of here!"
Okay, so not exactly a relaxing spa day.
No, not at first.
Right.
But if you can push past that initial shock, your body goes into survival mode. You
Okay.
start shivering, which is actually a really clever way to generate heat through rapid muscle contractions.
So it's like an internal workout
Exact.
fueled by the chills.
Yeah, and that ties into some of the metabolic benefits that research is starting to uncover.
Okay, so we're talking calorie burning.
Potentially, yeah. There's growing evidence that cold exposure can actually change the type of fat we have.
Wait, hold up. Different types of fat.
So think of white fat as your body's energy savings account,
Okay.
just sitting there. Brown fat, on the other hand, is more like a furnace, constantly burning calories to generate heat.
So the more brown fat you have, the better you handle the cold,
Generally, yeah.
and maybe even shed a few extra calories along the way.
There's definitely evidence that brown fat plays a role in metabolic health.
Okay.
Studies have shown that people with more brown fat activity tend to have better blood sugar control and insulin sensitivity.
Interesting. So cold exposure could be a way to boost this brown fat
Yeah,
and potentially help manage those things.
that's what some of the research suggests, but
Okay.
cold exposure alone isn't a magic weight loss solution.
Right. No escaping the laws of thermodynamics.
Right.
Still, it's pretty cool to think that a chili dip could have some positive metabolic effects.
Absolutely, and the benefits may extend beyond just metabolism.
Okay.
There's also promising research looking at cold exposure's impact on the immune system.
Yeah, speaking of the immune system,
Yeah.
I read about a study where folks who took a cold shower every day were less likely to call in sick from work. Is there actually a connection there?
It's still an area that needs more research, but some studies have shown that cold exposure can actually cause changes in white blood cell counts, which are key players in our immune response.
Okay, so while more research is needed,
Right.
there's a possibility that regular cold exposure could help give our immune systems a bit of a boost.
Potentially, yeah. Some scientists are exploring this, and it's pretty exciting.
Yeah, but the potential benefits of cold exposure seem to go beyond just the physical.
Oh, definitely.
Many people swear by cold water immersion for its effects on their mental health, too.
That's right.
Oh, yeah. I've heard people describe this incredible sense of calm
Right.
and even euphoria after a cold plunge. What's going on in the brain when we do this?
Well, cold exposure triggers a massive release of hormones, including those feel-good neurochemicals, dopamine and norepinephrine.
Okay.
And there's even research suggesting that cold water swimming could be a potential treatment for anxiety and depression.
It's like a reset button for your mind.
Yeah, exactly.
That's incredible. And you actually work with the Canadian Armed Forces using cold exposure as part of their training, right?
Yeah, that's right.
What can you tell us about that?
So we use cold water immersion to help them develop stress resilience and improve their decision-making under pressure.
Wow.
It's a way to push their limits in a safe and controlled environment.
So it's almost like a workout for their nervous system, helping them build the mental fortitude to handle anything.
Exactly.
That's really powerful.
It's about building resilience.
Okay, so let's say someone is intrigued by all of this and wants to give cold exposure a try. What advice would you give them for safely incorporating it into their routine?
Well, the first thing is always safety.
Right.
Start slowly and gradually, Don't just jump into a freezing ice bath on day one.
Yeah, yeah.
Listen to your body.
And of course, talk to your doctor before starting any new cold exposure routine, especially if you have any health conditions.
Absolutely. Yeah.
All right, so once you have the all clear,
Right.
consider starting with cold showers. They're a great way to ease into it because you can easily control the temperature and duration.
Right.
And I've heard you talk about the counting walls approach before.
Yeah.
Can you explain that for our listeners?
Sure. So the idea is to acknowledge those mental barriers that come up during cold exposure as walls. You'll feel the urge to jump out, but by consciously choosing to stay in, you're training your mental resilience.
Yeah.
Each time you push past that urge, you've conquered a wall. It's a great way to track your progress and build that mental toughness.
That's a really helpful technique. What about the Seaberg principle? What's that all about?
So, the Seaberg principle is named after a cold exposure researcher, and it emphasizes allowing your body to reheat naturally after cold exposure.
Okay.
This means resisting the urge to jump into a hot shower or bundle up immediately.
Okay.
Yeah, it might not be the most comfortable thing, but it actually helps boost those metabolic benefits by encouraging your body to shiver more and activate that brown fat we talked about.
So shivering is actually a good thing in this case.
Exactly. It's a sign that your body is working hard to generate heat and potentially leading to those positive adaptations over time.
We've covered a lot of ground here.
Yeah.
But before we move on, any other practical tips you'd like to share?
One thing that comes to mind is timing.
Okay.
Since cold exposure can raise your body temperature afterward,
Right.
it's generally best to do it earlier in the day
Yeah,
rather than right before bed.
that makes sense.
Yeah, you don't want to interfere with your sleep.
Anything else to keep in mind when it comes to the duration and intensity?
Well, you don't need to spend hours in an ice bath to reap the benefits.
Right.
Even short bursts of cold can be effective. One study found significant dopamine increases after just an hour in cool water, around 60 degrees.
That sounds much more manageable than a full-on ice bath.
Right. And another study showed that even just 20 seconds in very cold water, around 40 degrees, can trigger a significant adrenaline release.
So the key is to find what works for you and your individual tolerance.
Yeah,
Start small and gradually increase the intensity.
absolutely. It's all about personalizing your approach to cold exposure
Oh.
and finding what feels both challenging and sustainable for you.
This has been so insightful. I'm already feeling inspired to take a cold shower.
Yeah.
We've covered the amazing ways our bodies respond to cold, from that initial shock to the potential metabolic mental health benefits. But we're just getting started.
Right.
When we come back, we'll dive even deeper into the science behind cold exposure and look at how it can impact athletic performance and recovery.
Okay, sounds good.
Stay tuned.
All right. So welcome back to our deep dive into the world of cold exposure.
All right, so now I'm curious about how all this plays into athletics,
Yeah,
especially for recovery after, those intense workouts.
that's a great question. And it's one that athletes at all levels are asking.
Right.
Some swear by ice baths,
Right.
while others worry about, hindering muscle growth.
Yeah.
So let's look at what the research says.
Okay, so one of our sources, an article from the European Journal of Sports Science, looked at how cold water immersion impacted recovery after a simulated tournament.
Okay.
And it seems like cold water actually helped athletes recover their sprint speed faster.
Yeah, so for athletes competing in multiple events,
Right.
a quick cold plunge could potentially help them bounce back more quickly.
Okay.
And other research has shown that cold water immersion can help reduce muscle soreness.
Makes sense if you think about it.
Mm-hmm.
Cold helps constrict blood vessels,
Right.
which can reduce swelling and inflammation in those tired muscles.
Exactly. However, there's also research suggesting that cold can sometimes interfere with muscle growth.
Okay.
This is something athletes focused on building strength might want to be mindful of.
So it's a trade-off. Faster recovery, but potentially less muscle gain.
That's the current thinking.
Okay.
Dr. Jonathan Peake, a researcher at the Queensland University of Technology, found that ice baths after strength training could potentially inhibit muscle growth.
Interesting.
It seems like the cold might interfere with the activation of satellite cells, which are essential for muscle repair and growth.
Wow, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
So it sounds like timing could be key here.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on when to use cold exposure for recovery, if at all?
Well, some experts suggest waiting at least 6 to 8 hours after a workout before doing cold water immersion.
Okay.
This gives your body time to initiate those muscle building processes, or you could even consider doing cold exposure before your workout.
Before.
Yeah.
So using cold as a pre-workout ritual.
Well, think about what happens when you expose yourself to cold. It triggers the release of adrenaline and noradrenaline.
Right.
These hormones can increase your alertness and focus.
So it's like a natural pre-workout boost.
Exactly.
I like that.
Yeah, so the key takeaway here is that cold exposure can be a powerful tool for athletes,
Right.
but it's not a one-size-fits-all approach.
Yeah.
You need to consider your individual goals and how cold exposure fits into your overall training plan.
It's all about finding that balance between recovery and performance.
Right.
And as always, listening to your body is crucial.
Absolutely.
Now, let's shift gears a bit.
Okay.
We've talked about potential benefits,
Mm-hmm.
but we also need to be aware of any risks associated with cold exposure.
Absolutely. Cold water immersion can be invigorating and potentially beneficial,
Right.
but it's not without risks, especially if you're new to it.
Okay.
That initial cold shock response we talked about earlier,
Right.
it can be intense.
Yeah,
For some people, it can trigger a dangerous increase in heart rate and blood pressure.
that makes sense. And I imagine for people with certain health conditions, like heart disease, cold exposure, could be particularly risky.
Absolutely, yeah. It's crucial to talk to your doctor before starting any kind of cold exposure routine,
Right.
especially if you have any underlying health conditions.
Always better to err on the side of caution.
Yes, definitely.
And even if you're perfectly healthy,
Mm-hmm.
it's important to start slowly and gradually, right?
Excellent.
No need to jump into the coldest water you can find.
Right. Start with shorter exposures in cooler, but not freezing, water, and gradually increase the duration and intensity as your body adapts.
Okay.
And always have someone with you, especially when swimming in open water.
Safety first. Okay, so shifting back to the potential benefits,
Mm-hmm.
I'm really interested in this diving response you mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
I've heard freedivers use it to stay underwater longer.
Yeah.
What exactly is going on there?
So, it's an incredible physiological reflex that's triggered when our faces, particularly our nostrils, are submerged in cold water while we hold our breath.
Okay.
It's believed to be an evolutionary adaptation,
Okay.
something that helped our ancestors survive in aquatic environments.
So when we dunk our heads in cold water,
Mm-hmm.
our bodies basically go into survival mode.
You could say that.
Okay.
The diving response slows down our heart rate, constricts blood vessels in our limbs,
Right?
and redirects blood flow to the brain and heart.
Wow.
It's all about conserving oxygen and protecting vital organs.
That's amazing. And I've read that intentionally triggering this diving response through things like cold water face dunks could have calming and stress-reducing effects.
That's right. While more research is needed to fully understand the connection between the diving response and mental health,
Okay.
there's growing anecdotal evidence suggesting that it could be a powerful tool for managing stress and anxiety.
It's almost like we're hacking our own physiology to tap into these ancient survival mechanisms.
Exactly, and it goes back to that idea we talked about earlier,
Right.
that cold exposure can be a way to train our nervous system to respond more calmly and effectively to stress in general.
This is all so fascinating.
Yeah.
But before we get too carried away, I think it's important to remember that cold exposure isn't one size fits all.
Right, absolutely.
People respond differently to cold, right?
Absolutely. There are a number of factors at play, including body size and composition, previous experience with cold,
Right.
overall health status, and even genetics.
So someone who lives in a colder climate
Mm-hmm.
or regularly swims in cold water might have a totally different experience compared to someone trying it for the first time.
Exactly. And it's not just about physical adaptations.
Yeah.
Mental factors like your mindset and stress management techniques can also play a role in how you experience cold exposure.
Right.
It's a complex interplay of variables.
So I'm hearing a theme here.
Mm-hmm.
Listen to your body,
Yeah.
start slowly,
Yeah.
and find what works best for you.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
There's no magic formula.
Right.
Approaching cold exposure with a sense of curiosity and experimentation is key.
Okay.
Pay close attention to how your own body and mind react and adjust your approach accordingly.
Great advice. Now, as we wrap up this part of our deep dive,
Yeah.
what are some of the key takeaways you want our listeners to remember about the science of cold exposure?
Well, I think it's important to acknowledge that while cold exposure holds a lot of promise, the scientific evidence is still evolving.
Yep.
Some of the claims about its benefits, particularly around weight loss or immune function, require more research.
So it's important to approach cold exposure with a healthy dose of skepticism and not believe everything you hear.
Right.
Do your own research and see what works for you.
Exactly. But at the same time, don't let that stop you from exploring.
Okay.
The potential benefits are exciting, and even if the science isn't fully conclusive yet, many people find cold exposure to be incredibly beneficial for both their physical and mental well-being. It's all about finding that balance, embracing the potential while also being aware of the limitations.
Absolutely.
And remember, talk to your doctor before starting any new cold exposure routine, especially if you have any health concerns.
Absolutely. But above all, approach cold exposure with a sense of adventure and curiosity.
Okay.
You might be surprised by what you discover about yourself and your own capacity for resilience.
I love that. Okay, folks, we're about to chill out for a bit.
All right.
When we come back, we'll explore the fascinating concept of using cold as a tool for personal growth and resilience.
Sounds good.
Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to the Deep Dive.
Right.
We've been exploring the science of cold exposure,
Yeah.
the good, the bad, and the downright chilly.
It's been a journey.
And, as we've been looking at all this research, one thing that keeps coming up is that a lot of these studies focus on those immediate effects of cold.
Yeah.
Like what happens in those first few minutes
Right.
after you get into that ice bath.
Yeah, like how your heart rate spikes and you get that initial shock.
Exactly. And it makes sense, right?
Right.
It's easier to measure those immediate physiological responses.
Exactly.
But what's harder to study, and what I'm really fascinated by, are the long-term effects
Yeah.
of regular cold exposure.
Yeah, right.
Like, do those initial changes actually lead to lasting adaptations in the body?
Right. That's the big question.
We've seen some hints of this in the research. For example, studies showing that people who regularly swim in cold water tend to have higher levels of brown fat activity.
That's a great example.
But what about other potential long-term effects?
Right.
Do those improvements in insulin sensitivity, those changes in immune markers, do they stick around or are they fleeting?
It's hard to say for sure.
And what about the mental health benefits that people report? Does that feeling of calm and resilience last beyond that initial post-cold rush?
I think those are all really intriguing areas for future research.
Definitely. And it's not just about, how long the effects last. We also need to figure out the optimal dose of cold exposure.
Yeah.
How much, how often, at what temperature?
Exactly.
These are all important factors to consider.
And you mentioned earlier that one study found positive effects with just 11 minutes of total cold exposure per week,
Right.
which is pretty encouraging.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be these extreme hours-long ice baths to make a difference.
Exactly. And I think it's important to remember that there's no one-size-fits-all approach here.
Right.
What works for a seasoned winter swimmer might be completely different for someone just starting out with cold showers.
Right, so it really is about experimenting
Yeah.
and paying attention to how your own body responds. Like what feels challenging but doable for you.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay.
It's about personalizing your approach to cold exposure.
Right.
And finding what you can sustain over time.
And that brings up a really important point, I think,
Yeah.
which is this idea of personal agency. Like we have the power to choose how we use cold exposure as a tool.
Yeah, I love that you brought that up.
Okay.
It's not about forcing ourselves to endure something miserable.
Right.
It's about approaching cold exposure with a sense of curiosity, experimentation, even playfulness.
Yeah.
Like, what can you learn about yourself through this process?
And by stepping outside our comfort zones in a safe and controlled way, of course,
Yeah.
we can build resilience, both physically and mentally.
It's like we're reclaiming an ancient human capacity.
Okay.
Our ancestors lived in environments where cold exposure was unavoidable.
Right.
It was part of daily life.
And by reintroducing controlled doses of cold into our modern lives, we might be tapping into something deep within ourselves, something we've lost touch with.
Exactly. It's like rediscovering a hidden superpower, this ability to adapt, to overcome challenges, to find strength in discomfort.
Well said. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of cold exposure, what are some key things you hope our listeners will take away?
So first and foremost, I hope they'll be inspired to explore cold exposure for themselves safely and with a sense of curiosity. Start small, listen to your body, and don't be afraid to experiment.
And remember, the science is still evolving.
Right.
So approach those bold claims with a healthy dose of skepticism.
Yeah, exactly. But at the same time, don't let that stop you from experiencing the potential benefits firsthand.
Okay.
Many people find cold exposure to be incredibly transformative for both their physical and mental well-being.
So find what works for you, stay safe, and embrace the challenge.
Yeah.
Who knows, you might just discover a hidden superpower within yourself.
I love that.
And if you do decide to take the plunge, we want to hear all about it.
Yes.
Share your experiences, your insights, your questions.
Yeah.
Let's keep this conversation going.
Absolutely.
And if you enjoyed this deep dive into the world of cold exposure, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe to The Deep Dive for more fascinating explorations into the world of science, health, and human potential.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for listening.